I'd like to pursue that. I don't know what the source for that would be, if it's been tried anywhere yet, or if there's somewhere we can point to find that, or if they have a style of democracy that works better. I think capitalism spurs democratic participation, sometimes more than it should. It's tough because I'm hearing that capitalism doesn't deserve credit for all the good things that it produces. It's the state, part of the state capitalism is doing it, that we still want the state to wither away. And I'm trying to calibrate here. I think democracy on a, not small in scope, but smaller scale. I think, local mutualistic democracy is quite compatible with, capitalism, and I'd like to see, more of that. It could be more effective at fighting some of the centralizing techniques that people who call for democracy want to oppose. I'd suggest.
Thank you. Two very important things to understand about democracy. One, the pure democracy isn't always a good thing. If you've ever heard of tyranny of the majority, what happens is, as long as 51% of the population support one thing, they can completely ruin the lives of the other 49%. So, obviously you're going to want some sort of constitution in there, some rules for the government, which unfortunately they tend not to listen to. Second thing is, there is no system more democratic than capitalism. Now, it sounds very strange, but here's why. You can vote. Usually there's a choice of two politicians. They usually lie about everything they're going to say once they get into office. And that's the say you have in the political process. In the market, we actually all have much more of a say. We like certain products, we decide to buy them. Those businesses do well, the other businesses do not. There's a business that has horrible practices that people find out, less people buy from them. Politicians don't have to produce anything that people like. They just have to get votes. That's why we invade countries we don't want to. That's why we spend money on ridiculous things. We don't even know what the budget is. Our money gets taken from us every year, and we have no idea what it's going to. You could be pro-life, and it could be going to Planned Parenthood. You could be a pacifist, and it could be going to, drone strikes overseas. In the market, that's not the case. You're going to buy something, and generally, as long as you're paying attention, you're going to know what you're buying.
I would like to disagree with my opponents over here about the relationship between democracy and capitalism, right? They're talking about democracy being compatible or in sync with capitalism. I would argue the opposite. I would argue democracy and capitalism are antagonistic, right? Fundamentally antagonistic, right? Related to that, I would argue that to understand democracy, we should understand the different forms of democracy, right? There are three conceptualizations of democracy in my mind, right? If you think about when people talk about democracy, I think of three different kinds of meanings of the term, right? One meaning of the term is a system in which the majority of the vote, the rule of the majority in the ballot box wins out, right? Okay. In the United States, what percentage of Americans voted for the presidential, the winner of a presidential election, right? Not 51%, 25%, right? Democracy doesn't exist in that first sense. The second sense is the idea of majority rule, not through the ballot box, but the general sentiments of the populace. If the general census of the populace favors one thing over another, that more often than not, that will rule out. I have serious questions about that's the case. Anybody who knows about how the lobbying efforts work in the United States realizes that it's completely distorted. So I would argue that one doesn't work either. The third definition of democracy has to do with, if you will, a mode of being. Right? If you look at the founding fathers, right? They had a very different sense of democracy than people have today, right? Jefferson, you can call him a socialist if you want. Jefferson, right, had this notion of democracy as being, an active engagement, right? An active self-governance, right? As that people had a way of being in this world where they realized the responsibilities of the individual for the collective. Collective, right? So does that kind of sentiment, is it realized in America today? There's a little bit of evidence in terms of voluntary association participation, right? But that's going to decline in the last 30 years. But in general, if you think about how people interact, and if you think about how people interact in the public square, right? I would argue, and we could talk for a long time about it, but that third dimension, that third definition of democracy is not realized either. So when we talk about democracy in America, I would say I would like to see it, right? You know, I'm not opposed to democracy. I would love democracy, but I don't think it's compatible with capitalism.
What would it look like to have it then? What outcome would you call democratic?
What outcome?
If we had it in America, describe it.
If we had it in America, I would see three things, right? I would see the vast majority of people participating in elections, right? Exactly what I said, the three things that I just said, right? Right, the will of the majority being manifested in law rather than the will of the 1% and the lobbyists, right? Right, on a regular basis, right? Not simply when it's convenient to the 1% and the lobbyists, right? Because they'll obviously allow certain things to pass if it doesn't threaten their particular interests, right? So and then the third thing that you have to, I don't even know if it's possible in a capitalist society to even approach the third one, this mode of being that focuses on democratic ownership over our society in light of these massive, rich corporate and individual interests that are above us.
Okay.
Can I add to that?
Yeah, sure.
Just to put it in a little bit of a simplistic kind of way, say you work 8 hours a day, that's a third of your day, which under capitalist society you are selling to the capitalists, and that is certainly not democratic. And then you go home, and then you have freedom to choose whatever you'd like to do. So I just don't understand how you can have democracy when you only really have, 66% free time.
You're choosing to work at the place, though.
You're not choosing to do that. You are doing it to survive.
Well, I mean, what else would you do? You can't just you have to work.
Well, right. A person is going to labor. You have to labor to survive, but you don't have to sell your labor to the capitalists.
Yeah, that's your
People
choice.
do not have there's no democracy in the workplace. You go to work, you are doing what someone is telling you to do. It's hierarchical in a capitalist society. There's nothing democratic about that.
So should the Eagles not have a head coach then? Like, if somebody invests in capital using whatever resources they have, whether they take the tremendous risk of taking out a loan, and if anyone's a small business owner in here, you know what you're talking about. I mean, you take out a tremendous amount of money, it's a tremendous risk, and then you have somebody work for you. Why should the person that's working for you get the full price of whatever they're producing? It doesn't make any
Because
sense.
they're the ones producing it. The workers are the ones
But
producing
they
it.
wouldn't be able to do it without that capital. I mean, let's take a very simple example, a wooden bowl. Try making a wooden bowl by hand. You can probably make 1 or 2 a day. If somebody has a machine that helps you make them that they personally invested in, why should you get the full price
Who's running the machine?
for that bowl?
The capitalist is the one who just simply owns the means of production. He's not the one doing the production.
That's because he was the one that got it there in the first place. The worker didn't do anything. You're exploiting the
They're
owner
doing
of
everything.
not to get the capital there.
Well, that's where the notion of private property comes in. Should people really be able to own that and say, I own this, but you can produce it and I'll give you a little bit.
Can I ask about private property? Because I'd like to push that a bit.
We're getting to the nitty-gritty.
No, well, I mean, so let's talk about democracy. So the way I understood, the 3 components you're calling for are participation.
That's not I mean, other people said.
Right, but I pressed you a little bit, hopefully that sounded plain enough. But I mean, participation levels, and then the second seemed to be that there's, forgive me, but that sounded like an assumption that if the first type or first indicator was present, the second would follow, that you
Well,
could
they're
get policy
independent.
outcomes.
They're independent of each other.
So are we assuming that if participation rates go up, we'll get policies that are more friendly to, or more?
No, I was just describing, I don't want to.
It seems like the first one is a claim, and the second is a belief about what would follow from higher participation rates.
No, it's a different understanding of what democracy is. Right?
Okay.
I mean, you can talk about democracy being a formal system, that's the first dimension,
Sure.
right? You talk about democracy being a system in which the sentiments of the majority win out in public policy, that's the second half.
So if we had 80% voter turnout and elections ended up the same way, would that be an indictment of the first notion of democracy?
If we had 80%, well, if you have 90, well, 80, that's 40. there's just different ways of understanding it,
Okay.
right? I mean, the second one deals with the idea of the practical realities of things like lobbying.
Okay, but if we had higher turnout, but we still got that outcome, then maybe it's that we still don't have the third part, that the mode of being still needs to be addressed.
Yeah, there are three independent
Sure.
factors, right? And the idea of democracy, in I think that in the robust way that the founders of modern democracy had in their head, would encompass all three of them.
Founders of what? I'm sorry.
The founders of modern democracy.
Okay.
I think it encompassed all three of those sentiments, right? A genuine democracy, right, would embody all three of those simultaneously.
So as far as mode of being goes, and I want to explore this concept. If we want to talk about Jefferson, he was, among other things, leveraged significantly in his desire to acquire private property. So this mode of being that you're calling for, does it abolish private property? Does it ignore it? Does it retain it? I mean, that you don't have to own everything about Marx. But that's important.
I would argue that there's a dialectic here, right? There's a contradiction here. This idea of liberty, right, is inherently, this is what Marx is basically saying in one way or another, right? That there are inherent contradictions in the productions of systems and thought processes and behaviors that are rooted in a system that has private property as a space, right? In Jefferson, of course, was, the founding fathers. I mean, Washington was a billionaire. Well, compared, he's a really rich guy, right? And everybody loved democracy as well, right? So the idea, there are contradictions all over the place.
Sure.
Right? And I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying that this is part of the reality, right? There are contradictions.
So the mode of being you're calling for can be compatible with
I'm
property
saying that the
ownership.
mode of being of the figures, the Enlightenment figures, and the products of the Enlightenment, the revolutions, right, were inspired by a mode of way of being that was fundamentally different than the mode of being that today. We're in an industrial or a post-industrial society, capitalist society, in which, I don't want to use the Marxist terms of reification and mystification, but this is what we're talking about. People have become immune to their humanity, right? Whereas the founders of modern democracy cherished this romantic notion of humanity, right? And capitalism is a phony shell of humanity, right?
I think we're talking about competing Enlightenment visions, not that there's,
Granted.
I think the framers were Scottish Enlightenment thinkers.
Yeah, they were diverse, right?
A few questions in the audience.
Yeah, I like the theorists going at it.
You might be the only one.
I don't know.
It's like
I don't
getting a
even
3-class
understand
course,
this.
but I guess you.
Okay, so
Who's it directed at? I'm sorry.
more towards the communist side. So in a system that apparently values humans before profit, and you would want to abolish private property, how would you coerce an individual that did not want to give up his private property or consent to your system of society? Would you force a gun in their face and make them submit until they did, or would you just kill them all?
Chop off their heads, right? So, you want to take this or want to
You could start off.
Right. Now, a couple things about this, right? How do we force them? Marx, Marx arguably was a romantic in this sense, right? That it would be, people would just willfully, once they get into a new mode of being, right, they would be willing to surrender or whatever, right? But again, it goes back to this notion of we are products of our times, and the mode of being is a product of our time, right? And so it seems to me the question is not forcing, us to move from point A to capitalism, to private property as a base, to a society. I don't want to be Pol Pot. Anybody know Pol Pot? I don't want to. I'm not subscribing to this kind of craziness, right? But I am subscribing to a system where we socialize, not through the state, right? But we socialize the means of production, right? That doesn't mean that the state, right? The state's not going to be around as we know it in my kind of world, right? But it will be voluntary. The idea is that the modes of production, the economic systems, right, from a Marxist perspective, are the key determinant in shaping our ways of being. That's the question, right? That's the issue, right? And capitalism shapes a mode of being that's incredibly productive and creative and incredibly destructive and at the same time, right? And so how do we get out of that mode of being, right? Well, you know, you could say, well, the proletariat are going to rise up and chop the heads off all the rich people and demand that they give up all their property, right? Or perhaps there's an alternative way. Perhaps you can do it from the ground up, right? Habermas, for example, another theorist who really started as more of a Marxist, but later became more of a Weberian, I would argue, suggests that we need to engage through our practices, right? And on the grass level, alternative ways of being, right? Arranging co-ops, for example, right? It may sound trite, right? But that's not the start, that's not the end, that's the start, right? If you arrange alternative ways of being, for example, in the classroom, right? If I wasn't such a hypocrite, I could arrange my classroom in an alternative way. My classrooms are very traditional, right? The authoritarian on the top, teaching everybody to be good little disciplined workers after they leave, right? You know, if I were subscribing to this model of evolutionary change, right, as a way of combating the oppressive system, right, I would maybe structure my classrooms different, right, create alternative modes of being. We talked before about the cooperative ownership, having the workers own or control the workplaces, right? So these don't necessarily require the chopping of the heads off of people, right? And the idea of forcing and coercing people, I wouldn't subscribe to that. You can't force, you know, this kind of stuff.
I'm good. Since we got time winding down, I want to get just,
You got
I'll take one more question.
Yeah, I just kind of first start off with, you know, because of the destructiveness of capitalism, I'm just going to ask this question, and I think that brings up an important point about education and the Freirian understanding of the dialectical aspect of education. And my thing is, people evolve in terms of developing a critical consciousness, as he said, or actually develop what he calls a magical consciousness, right? And really, he sees what we're being now, he's passed away, of course, is magical consciousness. I mean, capitalism is very destructive and actually kidding ourselves. But on the other hand, I think that I'm just asking, I guess, in this time of the global South rising up in Brazil and Argentina in 2001, where the workers took over the means of production because capitalism just basically pulled out all its capital, all its money, and basically took it to the north. And then on top of that, we saw in Egypt what went down, and also, you know, especially in the Middle East and other parts of the Tanzania and other places around the world, rising up and developing. And I think we missed one part of the democracy is direct democracy. And I think that's what our experiments are, right? And currently, what is happening. And so, I guess for me, I'd ask is how can we? Why are we? I guess dismissing, or not? I guess not dismissing, but why are we not talking about the realities on the ground that are happening? The experiments in pedagogical practices, experiments of that with the bacheloreros in different parts of the South, and people self-organizing, doing co-ops in Venezuela and Cuba. And I'm just wondering, why aren't we tackling and just discussing those pieces where millions of people are being engaged in that, in direct contest, in direct challenge to the liberalization, the marketization, and the market fundamentalist perspective that the North is pushing down. And so for me, I'm just wondering, how can we think that is a sustainable practice when we have that either you take the bank or the tank mentality in the world? And that's just something I'm kind of interested to hear what the capitalists would have to say about that.
Yeah, go ahead, I'll tell you.
Well, it feels like we're being asked to defend something tangible, existing, and therefore containing flaws against an idea, and
Philosophically, theoretically.
right. And I feel like that's an open-ended proposition, to say the least. You know, Egypt's neither fish nor fowl. I don't think that's. But I would come back to Tunisia, and that started by a disgruntled small-scale capitalist. He just wanted his damn license to open his fruit stand. And I think that if I'm going to defend capitalism, I'm going to defend it with the notion that at present, until we have this mode of being shifted, if or when that will happen, most people, and I teach common law, I will argue about the First Amendment till the end of the day, but at the end of the day, fundamentally, people want to be left alone to make their way in life, And that starts with capitalistic activity rather than political activity. And I think if that's because of the current mode of being, then we can agree to that. And I wish you luck in having that change, because I might like the outcome too. It might be an improvement on capitalism, but until we can stop qualifying, those possibilities with might or hopefully or someday, what we've got right now, it is, if you want to call it the best of the bad lot, I wouldn't necessarily agree with that, but I'd agree with the best part. Part of the reason that, I'm cherry picking, but part of the reason that we don't hear about Cuba is because we can't go there because the state is involved in restricting that. And if there's one single thing, should I be given king of the world, which I wouldn't want because I'm not about coercion, but let's open borders. Let's allow for the free movement of labor, and if you don't want to call it labor, that's fine, but let's let people vote with their feet, because good capitalists, we like the exit right too, not just the voice. And let's have at it.
Yeah, and I'm not, highly educated on all the different scenarios you mentioned happening all over the world. I would say before we blame it on, free markets, we should certainly look at the role of the state. A lot of times states grant monopolies on certain businesses, put down unions, as Britain is famous for throughout their history. But I mean, if we're going to look at the reality of the world, I've mentioned many times, poverty has been decreased drastically all around the world, even in the U.S. I mean, they said wages have stagnated. If you don't include healthcare benefits, that's absolutely true, but the cost of healthcare is rising sharply. The poor person today in the U.S. on average is as well off as the middle class person in the U.S. was in the 1970s. So I mean, we can complain about real wages. There might be something to that, but people are better off in this country than they used to be, even if you're poor. All over the world, people's lives are getting better. So I think that's the reality of capitalism. The places that have the least free economies are the ones that are worst off, and there's studies on this. Dr. Anthony Davies, I forget what university he's from, he correlated economic freedom indexes that various institutions have put out with environmental degradation. The least free economies actually have the worst environments, believe it or not. They have the most child labor. They have the poorest people. The freer an economy is, the better lives they have in general.
I'll give the rebuttal, and then we're going to move.
Again, we're not arguing for these more authoritarian states. We're arguing for a different system, which is for the people more so than for the vanguard, if you will.
I would just respond. I think the way you phrased the question was why didn't we raise those issues that you raised, right? And the only thing I would say to that is my bad, right? I should have, right? Because there are lots of examples of alternatives to capitalism out there, right? And a lot of times we ignore those, which are not totalitarian, right? He didn't talk about Cuba; he talked about Argentina, right? So there are examples out there, and I think you're right. We should be focusing more attention on it. A lot of the protest movements, in the last 20 years, have been oriented towards this, whether it's the Zapatistas in the South or the Argentinians, right? Lots of protests, have been trying to create alternative economic modes of being, partly as a result of, sharing critiques that we're making.
Bosnia, the current riots in Bosnia are direct action against privatization efforts rather than nationalization efforts, from what I gathered.
Well, since time's running out, I'll let you guys have the closing statements for each of your sides. Since I see time reaching for it,
Yeah.
You start off first.
You better talk for an hour.
Okay, so
You gotta put 20 pages in it.
real quick, it's only a page and a half here. Nobel laureate economist Milton Friedman, Dr. Hayworth's favorite, appeared on the Phil Donahue show several decades ago. And Donahue asked him a series of questions about, poverty in the world and exploitation and whatnot. Donahue asked, when you see around the globe the maldistribution of wealth, the desperate plight of millions of people in underdeveloped countries, when you see so few have and so many have-nots, when you see the greed and the concentration of power, did you ever have a moment of doubt about capitalism and whether greed is a good idea to run on? Friedman replied, First of all, tell me, is there a society you know that does not run on greed? You think Russia doesn't run on greed? You think China doesn't run on greed? What is greed? Of course, none of us are greedy. It's always the other fellow who's greedy. The world runs on individuals pursuing their own separate interests. The great achievements of civilization have not come from government bureaus. Henry Ford didn't revolutionize the automobile industry that way. Einstein did not construct his theory under a government bureaucrat. If you want to know where the masses are worst off, it's exactly in the kinds of societies that depart from the ideas of capitalism and free trade. So the record of history is absolutely crystal clear. There is no alternative way so far discovered of improving the lot of the ordinary man that can hold a candle to the productive activities unleashed by the free enterprise system. Friedman said this in 1979, a time in which middle-class Americans have the standard of living most of the poorest Americans have today, a time in which millions of more people around the world were in absolute poverty. Capitalism is going to have problems. The world still has many problems. But since Friedman appeared on that Donahue show in 1979, the world has continued to get better and better, largely because of market capitalism. Economic freedom and free trade must continue to spread around the world in order to continue this trajectory of progress. Thank you.
I was unaware we needed closing statements.
I can end it.
I don't know, I just wanna like summarize our argument, that this notion that, that greed is the ultimate arbiter of success, it's, I mean, and the fact, and you say, you know, since 1979, the world has gotten so much better, I mean, has it really?
Yes.
Well, I mean, you said millions of poor, we still have millions of poor. I don't know, I don't want to turn this into a rebuttal. I'll just, I'll say that individual autonomy is not compatible with the capitalist system as we know it today, and it's seen through the actions of, you know, these revolutions that you never hear about, and just, I mean, it's not profits that motivate people. It's the human condition, which from birth is to be creative in your modes of production. And when you're working under someone else and you're told what to do constantly, you can't really fulfill that freedom.
All right, and with that, we'll conclude. I'd like to thank everyone for being here. I'd like to thank our speakers. Also, I'd just like to plug the Poli Sci Club hosted this event. We meet every